So, Berto, you remember doing an episode in which I talked about my Asian Del test?
Yes,
which is similar to the Bechdel test,
right?
In which a journalist, I believe by the name of Bechdel, proposed a test for movies and TV shows about sexism. Identify a movie in which you have two women characters who are talking, who have names. They're not just anonymous characters in the movie, and they're not talking about a man.
Yeah.
And when she came up with this test, you think, oh my God, really? I bet you hardly any movies pass this test, or
right.
A shockingly low percentage. And yeah, I mean, it's such a low bar.
Right.
It just sounds ridiculous.
Just talk about
just
something.
Two women who have character names in the movie, and they're talking about something without a man being there, and they're not talking about a man. So I came up with the Asian Del test. You came up with your Latino test.
Yeah.
And I watched a TV show called Beef on Netflix that not only passes but surpasses my Asian Del test. Let's get into it. What do you say?
Let's do it.
This is the Psychology in Seattle podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist and a professor.
My name is Humberto Castaneda, and I make shoes that you can use to play tennis.
So in this episode, we're going to talk about the Asianness of the TV show Beef, and then we'll talk about the psychology. There's a lot of psychological concepts that I think are explicit and implicit in this show that we'll get into. So I would say that this show, like I said, receives the highest rating possible. I don't think there's a better show that passes the Asian Del test. And what is the Asian Del test for me? Well, at the top of the list is that you have one character in the top three characters that is Asian American, who doesn't have a foreign accent.
Right.
The character has an American English accent. The person is noticeably Asian American, meaning that they're not half or quarter or something. Their character is characterized as being from East Asian descent. And their parents also have an American accent, because that's me. Almost every single Asian American that I know has an American accent. They are noticeably Asian American, and their parents do not have accents. I'm not saying you can't have a movie that has no Asian Americans. I'm not saying you can't have a movie that has an Asian American with parents that have accents. I'm just saying if you're going to have a culture in Hollywood that produces countless TV shows and movies, surely there would be a percentage of these productions that would pass this test, not only because of the American demographic facts, but also half of the movies and TV shows occur in Los Angeles, which is something like 15% Asian American. The setting is Los Angeles, just like in Beef.
Yeah.
And the fact that we almost never have a production that passes this Asian Del test is just upsetting and bothersome. So when Beef came along, I was really quite happy. But first off, Berto, how many Bertos would you give this?
Oh man, I love this show. I would give it a 9.
Okay. I gave it a 10 out of 10. Regardless of the ethnicity and the background of the characters, this is just a well-acted, well-written, compelling, interesting, relatable story. Excellent directing.
Superb.
Yeah, I just thought it was masterful TV making. It moves fast. Rotten Tomatoes, what do you think the critics gave it?
Okay, critics, they must have liked it, so 94%.
98.
Okay.
What about audience?
Audience must have also liked it, so 97%.
86.
Oh.
Yeah, I wonder why.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Did they... Okay, I have one theory. So sometimes, although Rotten Tomatoes audience, I don't know, but sometimes there are movies or shows where none of the main characters are likable enough. And this is one of those where they're both horrible people.
Well, almost everyone.
Almost everyone is. And so some people might be like, well, I couldn't relate to anyone, or they're just all horrible.
Yeah. Yeah, people consume art for different reasons, and I think there's a group of people that we're not included in,
right,
who are looking for something to relax to watch with your kids or your parents. You just want something that's kind of easy. And so let's talk about the Asianness of Beef. And Berto, as an adopted Asian, because you grew up in the States with a lot of Asian, all
my high school friends, well, not all, but some of my best friends were Asian.
Well, what they would say is we have one Latino friend.
Yeah, we had exactly that.
Okay.
Latino.
So let's talk about not only the fact that there's a lot of Asian Americans in this, but there's a diversity among the East Asian Americans depicted. Most of them are Korean Americans, but Amy is her character, played by Ali Wong, has a Chinese father and a Vietnamese mother. And I believe that is Ali Wong's ethnicity, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay.
I'm not entirely sure, but I think Ali Wong also has that ethnicity combination. And those are very different cultures. China and Vietnam are very different. There are very different cultures within China itself, within Vietnam itself. You have in Vietnam the North and the South and the rural and the city. And in China, you have just vast different groups across the nation, the history of these different areas. So even just saying this is not really knowing exactly what we're saying. So we have Daniel and his family being Korean American. We have Amy.
Oh, so that was an interesting one. Right off the bat, the show starts, and in one of the very early scenes, he has a call with his mom. And it took me back to, I roomed with a friend of mine, and it was like when he would have calls with his mom. It was the same, I never understood most of what they're saying because they spoke in Korean, but the inflections, the melody of the conversation, and sort of the nature of the relationship. My take of it was always like, to me, it always sounded like my friend was complaining to his mom. But it's actually more about the intonation, the quality of it's a melodic way that they speak. And so when I was hearing it in the show, I'm like, oh my gosh, that's my friend speaking to his mom. I'm back in college.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, we can't paint all Korean Americans with one brush, but it's a common enough experience that Korean Americans will talk about where they live in two worlds.
Yeah.
And they are Americanized, but they have Korean parents either living in Korea or in the States. Korean adult children and their relationship with their parents is very different than the typical American adult relationship with their parents.
Yeah.
Certainly there can be a lot of overlap, but for me, as a very Americanized Asian American, my Korean friends, their relation, and my clients for that matter, their relationship with their parents is very foreign to me. It's very boggling. The intensity of it, the way that you could be 45 years old and still treated like you're 10 by your parents.
So my recollection, and I saw the same thing in the show, and again, it could just be the only two people that I know, right? But my recollection was that I always thought, wow, he never smiles in any of the calls. It never sounded like there was levity in the conversation. When I call my mom, there's a lot of joking involved, and it's just my personality or whatever, and hers. And if you listen to it, even if it were in Spanish, you would be like, okay, even if we're having a difficult conversation, it'll sprinkle in some. So you'd hear with my friend, it was always like, is everything okay? It's like, yeah, we're fine. Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah, I mean, again, we can't paint everything with one brush, but I'll just say there's a very common profile depicted in this movie where Daniel is both really on the surface trying to impress his parents. If you just took verbatim what he says to his mom and dad, he is very loving, he's caring, he has a pleasant relationship with them. Yeah. But there's at least in this particular relationship, a very deep distance between him and his parents, and a sense of constantly running from disapproval from his parents.
Yeah. At the very least, I can say that even, like I said, even if they're the only two people, this character, not how awful he is, of course, but the way he behaved with his parents reminded me of my friend.
Yeah.
And it's like, if you saw someone in a show that behaved like a friend, that's what I was doing. I was recognizing someone that I know.
Yeah. And in contrast to my Americanized culture, which is, a combination of various different things that are passed down through American culture, also the Pacific Northwest. I have a theme of Japanese American in me as well. But when I went through my eyes, when I see it as a lot of guilt tripping, a lot of over-dependence, a lot of complaining, a lot of control from the parents compared to my parents, a lot of invasiveness, a lot of nosiness. So from my perspective, I would talk, if Daniel were a friend of mine, I'd just say, just draw a boundary with your parents. It's not your problem. Now, of course, in the movie or in the TV show, it is his problem because he involved the sketchy cousin and got the whole family out of the hotel, essentially.
Screwed up his brother, everything.
Yeah, and so the parents lost everything and had to go back to Korea in order to survive. And so he had an extra reason to be guilt tripped into that. But anyway, so there's a lot of Asianness there, a lot of Korean Americanness there. And again, there's a lot of different profiles of relationships between Korean American parents and their kids. We also have George, who was played by a Korean actor, but that doesn't bother me. There's some hubbub. As a Japanese American myself, it doesn't bother me too much for a couple reasons. One is that Japanese people are the aggressors historically in East Asia. Mm-hmm. They were literally the Nazis, make no joke about it. They raped, they pillaged, they colonized, they killed, they committed genocide for a good 10, 15 years. Yeah. Just complete dehumanization of Chinese people, of Korean people. They inhabited, they harmed, they dominated. It was horrific. So to feel bad for Japanese people, they're not traditionally the underdog in East Asia. So that's one. Two, since Japanese Americans have been in the United States for so many generations, there's not a lot of pure Japanese people anymore. A lot of them are half or quarter or eighth. So
yeah, like I actually couldn't tell. Like if you had said to me what nationality, I would have assumed he was probably Japanese.
Yeah.
But I'm also not the best at necessarily telling. It's just that I wouldn't have been able to say, oh, he's definitely Korean.
Some people say that they can tell that he's Korean. And for me, I couldn't tell. Yeah. The Japanese people, a lot of their genetics come from immigration from Korea thousands of years ago.
I could go on about how many Colombians were really Mexicans, for example.
Right. It didn't really bother me. I'm just glad to have... And almost everyone else in the show was of the ethnicity that their character was. Also, he just held himself like a Japanese American. He didn't hold himself different. And of course, there's a lot of different types of Japanese American. And his mom was played by a Japanese American. But anyway, so George, the character, Japanese American, and also the fact that he's tall. I don't know how tall he is, but he seemed tall and
It wasn't all short Asians.
Like Ali Wong. Ali Wong is very short. And so it was, I don't know, as a tall Japanese American myself, I just like to see, that representation. Like in 13 Reasons Why, there's a Asian American guy who plays a football captain or football jockey.
And that was the writer of that. You're thinking he was inspired from you.
Oh no, he told me.
Oh, he told you.
So the writer, the adapter of it was a novel that was adapted into the screenplay by my friend Brian Yorkie, and we were pretty good friends in high school. And the character in the book wasn't Asian American, but he made him Asian American because he remembered that, in our school we actually it wasn't just white guys that were the jocks; it was Asian guys too. And it turns out that guy was a horrific rapist human being that I was not, obviously. But anyway, so George, Japanese American, mom, very Japanese, American accent. So that's, and they depict that well too. So Japanese Americans have been around, like myself, for generations and generations.
Right.
My ancestors came to the United States 120 something years ago, around the turn of the century, around 1900. And so Japanese Americans, typically their parents and maybe their grandparents, like my grandparents, grew up in the United States and have American accents. So that was nice. And then to contrast this, majority Korean American kids that are adults around 30, because it seemed like they were in their 30s or something, right?
Yeah.
Typically, but not always, will have parents who were born in Korea or China or Vietnam, and the parents have accents. So that was well contrasted. Also, that the Japanese family was well off, whereas the Chinese, Vietnamese, Korean families were not, because the Japanese people, again, came over and were very poor. My ancestors were very poor. They were farmers who were barely holding on, and there was this movement in the early 20th century, because they were farmers in central Washington. There was a movement politically to get rid of them. They, white people were trying to pass laws and such that Japanese people, even though they were born in the United States, they couldn't own land, this kind of thing.
Yeah.
And
that's
so,
crazy.
yeah. And so they went through that phase, and they fought and they fought, and they put their kids through school. And each generation, there's more privilege and more wealth, so to speak. Right. So we see we imagine that George's mom's parents or grandparents had to fight those fights, but then eventually the descendants are able to be well off. And you see that, whereas you see someone like Amy, who's kind of in a transition zone where her parents had to struggle a lot, but they seem to be more established a little bit more in the United States. And Amy was given a little bit of privilege, but she had to fight really hard for herself. And that's, there's this conversation between Amy and George where George is like, you're so obsessed with money. And then Amy's like, it's always funny to me that the people that say that are the people who grew up with money.
Right.
Like, I grew up poor, so I don't have that luxury of just saying money doesn't matter, because money was a matter of life and death when I was young. And then you have a family like Daniel's family, which is even more teetering on the edge because they lost their hotel and basically became homeless, I think, and then they had to go back to Korea.
But they were on their way up in a way, and then so they had a huge setback.
Right, and you could argue that Daniel even turned to a counterfeit formula from the sketchy cousin because of racism and lack of opportunity. So you have to resort to working around the law, so to speak. So they have that kind of that strata within East Asian American people. Not everyone, of course, is like this, but it's an interesting contrast. And we also have the Japanese mom looking down on the Chinese daughter-in-law. So it's great that they have China, Chinese Americans, Vietnamese Americans, Korean Americans, Japanese Americans, but who is not represented in this group that should be?
From Asians, you mean?
Asian Americans.
I suppose Hawaiians, Puerto Ricans, or not Puerto Ricans, sorry, Filipinos.
Filipinos, yeah.
Yeah.
So, I guess you could argue. But in terms of numbers, so where do you think in the top 5 East Asian American populations, where do you think Filipinos are ranked?
Oh, man. Maybe third?
Second.
Interesting.
Yeah. Who's number 1, do you think?
Well, I would guess Japanese.
No.
Chinese?
Yeah, Chinese.
Okay.
So it's so interesting that you think Japanese, because I grew up thinking that as well.
Yeah.
Obviously, so many people that I know are Japanese American. But Japanese American culture is so much more represented in our culture.
I guess so.
There's a lot of Japanese restaurants. There's Japanese art. There, we have Japanese wajimaya, Japanese grocery stores.
Maybe I'm also biased because I think in this region especially, I feel, I don't know, maybe.
We have a lot of Chinese people and a lot of Filipino people in Seattle, way more.
If you had asked me, when I was younger, when I was a kid especially, like I certainly would have said Chinese because, for example, that's the only Asian food I knew was Chinese food.
In Colombia?
In Colombia and in New York, right? Like that's the only, but nowadays I feel like a lot of my influences and things and have been more Japanese. So
right.
Right.
So there's a couple reasons for that. One, we've been here longer.
Yeah.
Two, for various different reasons, white Americans were much more fascinated with Japan than other cultures. They, I think, related more to Japan because Japan had the technology and the military power relative to other nations.
Right.
And so Filipinos, there's definitely a pecking order in East Asia. And Japan is definitely at the top. And below Japan, I don't know the exact rankings. Of course, every country will have its own bias and its own racist attitudes, and Japanese people are quite racist towards other East Asians. Not all, but they have a problem, just like the United States has a problem. And I would say that anecdotally, the ranking system is you have Japanese people at the top, and this translates into the United States for Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans. Below them, you probably have Korean Americans. Below them, you probably have Chinese Americans. Below them, you probably have Vietnamese Americans. And then below them is Filipino, Cambodia, Thailand, Indonesia, Pacific Islanders. I'm missing someone in here, Mongolia. So there's definitely a ranking, and Filipinos, although rank second in population in the United States. How many Filipino restaurants are there? How many how many Filipino famous people are there?
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting.
I think Bruno Mars is actually half Filipino, if I'm not mistaken. But how often is that emphasized? So there's a lot, there's a whole history of Filipino colonization by Spain, colonization by the United States, a lot of racism, a lot of atrocity, a lot of genocide. Japan was not a great presence in the Philippines. So we still live with that, and they didn't have Filipinos in this movie or this TV show. They were referred to.
He's like, isn't the cousin always paranoid about the Filipinos killing him or something? Was it the?
What I remember is he talks about how he cozied up next to the Filipino inmates.
Yeah.
Because they protected him.
Yeah. But then later, who are the ones that they're gonna kill me? They're gonna castrate me.
Maybe it was the Filipinos.
It was also the Filipinos.
Yeah.
I feel like he's like, they saved me, and then later it's like, they're gonna kill me.
Yeah, something like that. Now, a lot of the Japanese restaurants, the teriyaki restaurants, they have employees or owners who are Korean or Filipino or Chinese because they know that if you're a Korean family and you want to, make a business and you start a Korean restaurant, you're not likely to get customers. Where if you start a Japanese restaurant, you're likely to get it.
Interesting. Because
white Americans are much more accustomed to teriyaki and sushi and all that kind of stuff. They're not used to the Korean palate. So it just perpetuates this notion of like, well, there aren't any Filipinos or Koreans in Seattle because I don't see them around, because they don't advertise it, because they probably feel like it's hard to do that, So another really great thing about this movie that I think you would appreciate, because this was mainly your point when we were talking about diversity in movie and TV shows, is that they weren't constantly referring to the fact that they were East Asian American.
Totally. So basically, I remember making this point in general, that I was looking forward to a day where like people are just a character in the movie or show and their grouping is ancillary. And it really felt that way. It was like, this was just a great story. And the fact that you can recognize that is great because you see the representation, but they didn't make it all about it or something. It wasn't like, there was almost nothing about it. Yeah. And that was impressive. It was exactly what one would want.
Yeah.
If I wanted like Colombians in a movie,
Colombian Americans,
I want them to just be great characters in the movie.
But the interim or the, Hollywood will throw you a bone. A movie will get greenlit if they're like, well, you have to be constantly referring to the fact that they're Colombian.
First of all, who's the Colombian in the movie? Well, he's the Miami drug connection for the secondary main character.
Right. There has to be just, the house has to look Colombian American or the way that white people expect it to look. And as I was watching the TV show, I'm like, so when are they going to do that thing where they have the exposition, they have some contrast where they run into the white, and they did it just really subtly, like Amy's boss, the really rich forester.
She started talking to her in Japanese or whatever.
The assistant.
Not the boss, the assistant was
So she says a Japanese phrase to a Chinese Vietnamese woman, which is akin to someone coming up to an Israeli and saying something in German and saying like, right? I'm relating to you. I mean, literally.
Right.
You're looking at two white people and from Europe, and you're like, German phrase. Yeah. Because to a Chinese Vietnamese person, saying a Japanese phrase to them is, that doesn't feel very good.
Sure. Yeah.
The history was not long ago when Japan was raping and pillaging those areas. So, New York Times article by James Pony Wadzik. I was reading it in preparation for this episode, and I marveled that the review in the discussion of the TV show didn't even mention the Asian characters. And this is a white guy writing this article. Until about halfway through, he mentions something about Asian Americans. And then the rest of the article doesn't refer to it. It's just a review of a fucking TV show.
Yeah.
When Crazy Rich Asians came out, that was all the articles. Oh my God, it's literally in the title. You know, it's like Asians in a movie. How weird is this? And for Beef, it's just nice to be normalized. Yeah. And to have Asian Americans who are dicks, who have three-dimensional personalities, who have regular, relatable. I mean, what's more relatable to an American than road rage, right?
Yeah.
And what's more counter to the Asian model minority stereotype than just a good old flipping someone off during a road rage?
And this was very key because, had this been made certainly in the 80s, but even 90s, 2000s, whatever, it would have been, he's a martial arts expert, right? And then she's growing
she's a mail order bride or something.
Yeah, something. And then the whole thing is more about that, right?
Right.
This could have been done with anyone.
Right.
And it's just great characters, great actors, great storyline. And they also authentically represent their backgrounds.
Right. Like there are Asian, they're not just bland characters without ethnicity. They have definite ethnicity, but it's not constantly, you and I don't walk around in our daily life going like, I am Asian American, I'm Colombian American. What am I going to do next? This is what a Colombian American, this is the way he would walk to his car. This is how he would dress. This is what he would say. This is how he would see the world. You're just a regular human being that has a background, and white people have a background, but when so many people have a similar background, it looks like they don't have a background. Everyone has a background.
I should do that. Every time I show up at people's houses, I'll be like, I want to inspect your coffee machine, and let's talk about drugs for a little while.
Yeah. So I was thinking about other movies and TV shows in which Asian Americans are just being Americans. Because at first I thought, I don't know if I've ever seen that. I don't know if I've ever seen a movie or TV show where Asian Americans were just being Asian Americans.
I mean, to be fair, he was in The Walking Dead as just an American character who happens to be Asian. But that's not a whole show or something. But
yeah, I mean, I'll take it.
Yeah.
I'll take it. And I came up with the following movies. Another one with Ali Wong, Always Be My Maybe. I think it's another Netflix
I don't think
movie.
I've seen that.
It's pretty good. It's rom-com. Ali Wong and Randall Park were friends in high school, and they kind of diverged in their life, and they rekindle their friendship relationship. Better Luck Tomorrow came out 20 years ago. Coming of age, sort of amateur.
That sounds familiar. I think I did see that.
I bet you anything your Asian friends dragged you to see that movie because you would have been in your late 20s.
Yeah, probably.
And a very young John Cho is in that movie. And the Asian guy from Fast and Furious.
Like, in college, they dragged me to Joy Luck Club.
Yeah. The Harold and Kumar movies.
Oh, yeah.
I mean,
that's true.
Yeah.
It's a great example.
One South Asian.
Those are just two dudes.
One Asian. Total American dudes.
Yeah. And it's great because, again, there's that little bit of like, okay, my father wants to be a doctor. That's like the extent of it.
Right. Yeah. And Harold doesn't really have that kind of element to it. The movie Searching, again, with John. There are a lot of John Cho.
Yeah.
Pretty much anything with John Cho or Ali Wong. But that's it. Everything, Everywhere, All at Once. You could say it's like half Asian American-y because the daughter, but the mom and the grandpa kind of just transplants from their country. You know what I mean? They don't seem to be fitting in, which is fine, but it's not like Beef or Always Be My Maybe, where you just have Asian Americans just living a regular Asian American life.
Right.
Fresh Off the Boat, the TV show, of course, really funny TV show. Randall Park and Candace Wu. Good show, but still kind of in that zone where the Asianness is definitely played up, Kim's Convenience, very similar. And I haven't seen Minari, which is another Stephen Yeun movie.
Wait, was that the guy that did Parasite?
No, different. And I feel bad that I haven't seen it. And I just want to point out that, again, when we talk about Asian Americans, we are talking about literally 60% of the population of the planet is Asian.
I mean, you forgot to mention Kung Fu with David Carradine.
Yeah, I did forget to mention that because it's a white guy, one, and it's... it's a story. You could argue that it has nuance to it in a way, but it really foreignizes Asian Americans and associates them with Kung Fu yet again. On its own, it's fine.
But I love that shit.
Yeah.
As a kid, it was
if you can snatch the pebble from it.
Yeah.
60% of the population, something like 5 billion people live within Asia.
Right.
So any of those people, if they were to come to the United States and emigrate, they would be considered Asian American. So that's a ridiculous category.
Right.
Well, they say, well, what about East Asian and Southeast Asian? Well, if we take those two groups, we're talking about 40%.
Jeez.
We're not even talking about India.
Yeah.
We're just talking about Vietnam, China, Korea, Japan, Philippines. We're talking about 40%.
That's crazy.
3 billion people. And so to say one is Asian American, East Asian American, Southeast Asian American, that is like combining all the people from the United States, from Canada, from Mexico, from Central America, all of South America, all of Europe, complete Europe, all of Africa, every country, every human being in Africa.
Oh my God.
Saying someone is East Asian and Southeast Asian is like saying all of that.
Yeah.
So if you were in Vietnam and someone came from Africa and someone came from Europe and another person came from the United States and another person came from Argentina, another person came from Mexico, it'd be like in Vietnam, there'd be one box that you would check that you're just like
not East Asian,
basically, and you're not Indian and you're not Russian. That's one box. Imagine you, people out there, being lumped in with Africa, Europe, North America, South America. That and they think of you as you're all the same. French people are like Colombians, are like Alaskans, are like the people from South Africa, people from Egypt. It's all the same. So when we talk about East Asia, that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, that's crazy.
And arguably, East Asia, Southeast Asia has more divergent cultures because there's been a lot of centuries to develop different pockets of dialect and history and genetics and stuff. Anyway, so...
that's one of the super interesting things because since all of Latin America was conquered by one of two powers... give or take, there's a little bit of French sprinkled in there, but it's mostly Spanish and Portuguese, right? And that's incredible because that gives this weird uniformity to the whole thing. And then you go to Asia and it's so many different languages and so many different cultures. If you travel throughout the Latin American countries, you will find a lot of similarities. First of all, again, same language mostly, except Brazil. And culturally, a lot similar food, similar style, similar things,
but different, right? I mean,
there are differences, but
even in Colombia, right? The coast has spicy food, and Bogota doesn't.
Yes, definitely, yeah. It's just I maybe I'm anti-biased or something. I just feel like I sense a lot more similarities, but it's not surprising because they were all conquered by one common
and in terms of history, relatively recently.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Whereas there are pockets in China and Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos that go back prehistory. The people have been there forever, and so the specificity of that culture and dialect is so specific.
And maybe
to
that's
that area.
The sad point of it is that it's the thing that would have given more diversity was kind of wiped out.
Right. Yeah. I mean, before the Spaniards showed up. Undoubtedly, the Pueblo people as opposed to the people that lived in Peru as opposed to the people that live in Alaska. I mean,
they in fact had more in common with the ancestors of a lot of those Asian civilizations.
Okay, let's do one more thing about the Asianness of this and then go to break. There's a lot of stereotypes that were not depicted, that were countered. And not on this silly way. It wasn't like, oh, I see what they're doing. They're trying to fly in the face of a stereotype. No, they're just depicting a believable human being. You know what I mean? So what were the Asian stereotypes that were thrown out the window?
So no one was a martial arts expert.
Yeah.
I didn't see one.
Yeah.
There also wasn't a wise sage, like the guru on the mountain trapping flies with the chopsticks.
Golly, you're really reminding me of some terrible tropes, yeah.
Yeah.
But if you're the MCU, then you replace that person with a white person.
That's true.
Tilda Swinton
that's
and
true.
Doctor Strange.
Yeah. To give diversity.
Yeah.
What else? I don't know. You tell me.
Well, model minority
The what?
The model minority.
Oh, the model minority. I see.
Have you heard of that before?
Yeah, I guess so. Like you have the minority, and they're kind of like little perfect token in the movie or something.
So you haven't heard of this stereotype. So this is the most loud stereotype that I've lived with. It's less so now, particularly in places like Seattle, but I still feel it when I leave the West Coast, which is that Asian Americans are considered to be quiet, obedient, hardworking, not non-bothersome. Of the immigrants, they do good in school.
I see.
They don't protest. They don't commit crimes. They're quiet. They're polite, and they do what they're told. So we're the model minority in that way.
I certainly have heard that, right? Like, well, the Asians, they're pulling their weight, unlike these other people.
Right. And it's a stereotype. I mean, certainly we can look at statistics, and you don't have to go very far. Specifically, when you start applying to college, if you're not Asian, you start realizing how much competition there is to get into good schools. And the people you're often competing against is a lot of Asian Americans or people literally emigrating from Asia just to come to college in the United States. So there are some statistics we can point to. There are rates of income and other kinds of markers in general, but we're talking about bell curves. We're talking. There's you have the Ali Wongs and you have the sketchy cousins. There's a bell curve. But yeah, so the model minority trope stereotype was thrown out. Submissive Asian women was thrown out.
That's true. Yeah, submissive Asian women is a thing.
Yeah, I mean, maybe you live so far from the stereotypes that you don't even remember them anymore. But there are a lot of people who still consider Asian women to always be submissive.
Yeah, or, I mean, that's one possibility. But the other possibility is I grew up originally in an environment that was so stereotyped that it was reduced to just two things. Martial arts and, actually three things. Martial arts, the wise old sage, and Chinese takeout.
Right.
Those were the three things.
Another thing that it threw out the window was that we're all the same and that we look alike.
Right.
There's a lot of different characters in the show.
Yeah.
Very different sorts of people. Also, the stereotype that we're the perpetual foreigner.
Like what you were saying. It was like everyone's got a thick accent. They haven't really nativized, that they don't really understand the cultures.
Yeah. In a movie or a TV show, and this is a trope, so say it's a sitcom that is occurring in a business, and you're in a business building, and of course they're white people, and they have some foreign investors that are coming, and the secretary comes and says, "The foreign investors are in the boardroom. You're late for your meeting." And the protagonist is like, "Oh no!" And then they pan to the boardroom. It's always Asians,
right?
Because Asian is sit-in for foreigner. If you had a group of black people or white people or brown people, it wouldn't code as foreigner. If you want foreigners, you have 10 Japanese guys in suits, and they don't even have to say anything.
Yeah.
I mean, you could look to a boardroom of 10 Asian guys, and they could all be Asian Americans.
Yeah.
It could be Berto at the lunch table in high school. And so, but it just codes that way. Or you need to have tourists that code as foreigners. Hire a bunch of Asian American actors.
Give them a camera.
Put a camera around their neck, and you have instant foreigners.
Right.
The fact that for majority
That's
of my life...
interesting thing.
What?
But what you're pointing out, I hadn't thought of that, because you're right that if you have a movie and you're panning through and you see some Latinos, some black folks, some other folk, you won't assume like, oh, those are foreigners.
Right.
And then you pan to a group of Asians, your mind might go there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or it could just be a bunch of fucking Asian Americans who are fourth generation,
right,
and they just like to take pictures.
Right.
Like, we exist. So the perpetual foreigner was, not represented there. The stereotype that we're nerds and that we're not aggressive or cool or rough, because you have the sketchy cousin who, he's a cool guy, right? In high school, he probably had a lot of charisma or something, right? Daniel seems like he's, pretty cool as well. Paul seems like a cool guy, the brother. Yeah. George, they all seem like...
But also, Daniel is not a smart person.
Right.
And yet his brother is definitely smarter. but was underutilized, you know.
Well, Paul was complicated because he was both pretty dumb about some things, you know, because
I just thought he was immature.
well, there's this moment when Daniel is like, you know, that's a bot, right? And Paul is like, no, it's not. And then Paul texts the person and says, are you a bot?
Yeah.
And the person's like, no, I'm not a bot.
Yeah, but that to me, like, look, I used to fall for things all the time when I was younger, and I mean like my 20s, you know. And so I looked at that like he's just naive, and
Okay.
you know, but the
Potato,
fact that he was
different words.
he
for,
seemed to be doing good in school. He was gonna be going to college. I mean, all these things.
Right.
He wasn't a dumb, you know, person, but he also wasn't like a genius. And then Daniel was certainly no genius.
No, there were so many things that he did, and it was wonderfully written and acted. It was such a great choice to make him. There were several moments where you're like, oh, you're a smart guy. You know, there are moments when he's talking to Ali, because Ali Wong's character, Amy, she's smart. She knows how to kind of run circles verbally around Daniel. And Daniel, there are times when he just seems like he hasn't thought a lot of deep thoughts.
Right. It's like the difference between when he tries to find her and it takes him several steps till he finally like locates her. And then after she realizes he's peed in her house and stuff, it takes her like 2 seconds to locate and call him.
I didn't even notice that. That's funny. Also, the stereotype that we're exotic and mysterious, you know, where if you want to, and Star Wars does this, and MCU does this.
Sure.
When you want the exotic character, like in Guardians of the Galaxy, and you have the alien,
make them look more Asian.
Yeah, if you want an alien and a strange character, then you have an Asian person dressing up as an Asian. I mean, Drax and the Emotion Woman are both Asian Americans, but you want the relatable protagonist, you hire
white dude.
You get a white guy. Yeah. And I guess you could argue that with Zoe Saldana, she's black and she plays also an alien, but yeah, it happens a lot. So exoticness is played up. Also, the Asian tiger mom is another stereotype that wasn't really presented. The Ali Wong, her character Amy, as a mom, was often trying to advocate for less pressure on.
Well, they had a chance to make George's mom that way, but she wasn't. She was way more complex than that.
Right. Yeah. You would, at the beginning of the series, it's like, oh, I get it. The mom is like this. I can now categorize her. And then they would have another scene where there'd be nuance to that. Yeah, there was a lot of, but it wasn't like played for shock value. Like you thought you knew this person. It was just like an unfurling of their full personalities. Anyway. Let's take a break. When we get back, let's talk about some of the other elements in this movie. What do you say?
Let's do it.
All right, we're back from the break. Let's do an OPP, Berto. What do you say?
OPP.
So these people became patrons all the way back in 2020 and have stayed patrons ever since. We have Madden, we have Zhao Zhao, we have Cecilia, Lauren, Veronica, Akisha. All these people didn't list where they're from.
Yeah, I was wondering.
Akisha, John, Nellie, Emma, Azzy, Lydia, Sarah, Roughneck, V, and Julie. So all these folks became patrons all the way back in 2020.
Wow.
And have stayed patrons through thick and thin, Berto, which is just the best. Recently, we also started a program on YouTube where you can become a member on YouTube.
Right.
And we've had a few people sign up, which is very gratifying to me. When I was embarking on the initiation of the program, I was like, oh, will anyone sign up? I don't know, or how many? And so it's just nice to know that when people sign up.
I got my first Cameo request.
Oh, right. So tell us about that.
You were encouraging me to sign up to Cameo, and I finally did. I got a request from Iceland to do a pep talk. I won't reveal the names, but it was a pep talk for someone very special, and I put it together, and they really liked it. It was appreciated. I even sang a little bit.
Yeah, I think you're a perfect match for Cameo.
Yeah.
You're good on improv. Yeah. You can sing. You're thoughtful. So that's great. I want to give a shout out to the very first members on YouTube. I think these are the very first members. We have Jom, good old Stella Annie. We have Diego, Luciana, Maddie, Fern, The Mommy Breakdown, which is a YouTube channel, Mercury, Nayeli, Jenny P, and Maria. Nice. I think we're our very first. I wrote it down because when we first started taking patrons, I didn't make a note of
who the first ones?
Because if you cancel, I don't know if you're on the list anymore.
Right.
And so I wanted to make sure I documented those very first people.
Nice.
You know, sort of like your first customer that walks into your restaurant.
Yeah.
Okay, so here are some other things about the psychology of the show, but I thought we'd talk about the Asian American sort of psychology issues. So the first one that's pretty obvious is the emotional suppression or the emotional troubles in these characters. So what did you see?
Well, so I got so many of them. On the one hand, Daniel is so internal. You know, he doesn't communicate even with his brother about what he's thinking, what he's going through, what he's struggling with. And so a lot of that, I could tell in that moment where he bursts and the show starts and the beef starts, that it was just like all this pent up world inside of his head that he just doesn't have anyone to talk to about. So that was interesting. And similarly, on the other side, what's the gal?
Amy.
Amy is, she's got her own crazy world. She is unhappy, so unhappy, but she can't really show it to everyone. And everyone thinks she's perfect and she's got to show it. She's always got to be, smile and pretend her life. Even that speech she gives when she's being honored, and it's like, you would think you can't have it all, but you can, like that kind of thing. It's so depressing.
Yeah.
So there's things like that. And then the brother is also interesting to me because he's
Paul.
Paul is presented as a simpler character, but at the same time, like, think about it. He thought he was going to go off to college, and as far as he knows, he was not good enough. So he must.
And he has an older brother that's constantly putting him down.
Right. He's like, I guess I'm just a failure, and he's got that whole thing. But he's trying to make it, man. He's got these crazy ideas, but his brother keeps telling him he's stupid for it.
Yeah.
It's intense.
Yeah.
And then there's George. George is sitting there like, the other thing that's great and complex about it is it's not just one of them that's like being unfaithful or trying to stray. Like, they're both not happy. They're both looking externally. And he at first comes off so well put together. So, he's a good looking guy, very well spoken. He seems like, he's the one character we can all relate to. He's very well established. No, he's a mess too. He's also a mess. And that was interesting.
Yeah. And the theme that I started to think about, the theme word was self-centered or selfish. Everyone, except for Paul. I mean, Paul comes across like a victim and someone who at his core is innocent and good. Maybe because Daniel actually protected him from what was happening. There's this scene where they flash back to Daniel's childhood, and Daniel and Paul are watching TV, and the parents are fighting in the other room.
Yeah.
I think about finances or something. And it's interesting in that as well, in terms of the Asian Americanness of it, is the Korean parents are arguing in Korean, and Amy, when she remembers her childhood, her parents are arguing in English because, of course, you have a Vietnamese woman and a Chinese man, and so they probably learned English so that they could communicate, or maybe they're a little bit more Americanized. You know? Just that little subtle difference was interesting. But for Daniel, he has one eye on his parents because he's concerned about what's going on in the other room as a kid. But he also is trying to protect his younger brother by saying, meanwhile, his younger brother is just seemingly oblivious to what's happening, because it's not his role to pay attention. But emotional suppression. Amy has a line where she talks about she's in therapy. And by the way, the therapy depiction I thought was pretty good. It was kind of bland. The therapist dropped the ball. I wanted the therapist to lean in with some compassion a little bit more, but it was not cartoonishly.
Right. It wasn't a Sigmund Freud, I shall dissect your brain.
Or judgmental, where... Because often, I'm pretty sure the writers use therapists as a stand-in for themselves or the audience to judge the characters. Yeah. The therapist is often saying things that people will yell at the screen as they're watching. And I'm like, that's not what therapy is. It's not yelling at people. Anyway, Amy talks about when she's in therapy about her childhood, and she's, my dad was not very good about emotion, and my mom thought emotional expression was just complaining about things. So a lot of immigrants, and of course a lot of late generation white Americans might be able to relate to this as well. But the thinking is that, and Amy goes into this, she talks about how her mom, one of the first things she noticed when she came to the States, running out, a refugee from the war in Vietnam, one of the first things she recognized was the birds singing. And birds not singing, chirping?
Chirping.
Birds, what do birds do? Tweeting.
Right.
But now we say Twitter. Anyway, she could hear the birds, and she was reminded that in Vietnam, the reason why there were no birds in, I think, Saigon was because of the famine. Everyone ate all the birds.
Yeah, all the birds were gone.
And so these individuals, the dad from China probably came from a generation, or at least was one generation removed from the atrocities of Japan in China. And the Korean parents definitely come from a history of atrocities.
And scarcity, yeah. Atrocities and scarcity.
Yeah. And when you have that history or you have that experience on a population, you don't have time to complain.
Yeah.
And as a child or as an adult, the hierarchy of needs. And the baseline is survival.
Right.
And if you're taking care of your children or you're taking care of your siblings or your town, people can't self-actualize. They can't say, you know what, I would like to cry about this. At least that's the perception. And so you just have to, keep going. Don't give up. Don't stop. Just keep moving forward. Keep moving forward. And of course, you deny your humanness, your emotion, your vulnerability, and you pass that on to your children, even though your children are not in that environment anymore. And so there's this transgenerational trauma that gets passed down. I know a lot of different groups of people around the world, often coinciding with atrocities and war and famine. For example, Polish people often, because, in World War I, World War II, and before that of World War I, there's a history of the people who live in Russia or the people who live in the German area invading and raping and pillaging, and refugees and genocide of the Jewish people in Poland. And you have these different groups of people that have been traditionally harmed, and you have then they emigrate to the United States. Through the generations, you see the echoes of that. And so, for example, for me, the thing that I can point to is that my ancestors came from famine. So southern Japan went through some tough times famine-wise. And so a lot of Japanese people emigrated to the United States about 120 years ago. And so my people came from that group of people. And then on my other side, a good chunk of my white side came from a famine that happened in Sweden, which my Swedish people came from kind of the central region, which is where IKEA was founded. It's actually in that town. And they emigrated. So a lot of Swedish people emigrated to Pennsylvania and to Minnesota. That's why Minnesota is associated with Sweden. They also came to Seattle, Ballard.
Interesting.
It's very associated with Scandinavia. But my people went to Kansas for some weird reason. There's a little Swedish community
in Kansas,
in the middle of Kansas in Salina. They became farmers, and they were foreigners trying to eke out an existence among oppression of the white citizens of the United States. So I have themes of that difficulty and that strife, but it's not as bad as having generations of genocide and rape and pillage and, having to eat your horse or see dead people on the side of the road. I mean, people in China and Vietnam, I mean, not everyone, but a lot. So you have, but George, for example, since he's fourth, fifth generation,
he hasn't seen any of that.
He doesn't have that. He doesn't have that. He was raised in privilege and had another Asianness part of this is that a lot of Japanese Americans rose to prominence in art and architecture, in sculpture and design. So back in the day, and I didn't know this until my dad told me about it, that during my dad's time in the 60s, Japanese people, which were the main Asian American, of course there are a fair amount of Chinese as well, but there are a lot of Japanese, that guess what jobs you thought you were slated for as a Japanese American in the 60s?
In the 60s?
Yeah.
I mean, that's interesting. 60s, I would have think dentistry.
No.
No.
Not that would come later.
Okay.
There's a lot of Japanese American dentists.
Yeah.
That's a very good identification. Yeah. That's phasing out to more Chinese and Korean people.
Okay.
But yeah, dentists and general medical professionals from education in the 70s and 80s, a lot of nurses, a lot of Japanese. You know,
so
it's sort of
60s, like 60s landscaping.
Yes.
Gardening.
So, and also art and design, drawing. So it's not because Japanese people are particularly good at design or landscaping or gardening. They are. I mean, there's a tradition of that. But it's similar to how you will find a lot of Middle Easterners who will drive taxi cabs or work at a 7-Eleven or start a convenience store. You know, think about the stereotype of Apu, this kind of thing.
Right.
The reason why is because you emigrate and you hook up with your community, and they say, you know what, I can help you develop your own 7-Eleven, your own convenience store.
And here's how I did it.
Because here's how I did it.
Yeah.
And white people will expect you to be there. If you start, you know, if someone from, I don't know, Syria were to open up a dentistry office, you'd get some side-eye glances, and maybe no one would even go to you because they don't expect to see a Syrian dentist, you know? But they do expect to see a Syrian cab driver or a Syrian convenience store owner. Well, that's it. So it's not only generated from within the community, but it's also kind of imposed from the outside. And so for Japanese Americans, for whatever reason, it was gardening and design. My dad didn't have any interest in becoming a designer, an artist, but he did have some innate talent. And he had a mentor, a white guy, who actually kind of shepherded him in that. And he enjoyed it. And he worked with a lot of other Japanese Americans, even though
that's fascinating.
There's not a lot of Japanese American, in terms of per capita. For me, when I experienced the stereotype, I had no idea about the gardening thing. I'm 16 years old and I got a job as a landscaper, weeding and mowing lawns, and it was such a horrible job. I mean, 8 o'clock to 4 o'clock, hard labor in the hot sun of it's not super hot in Seattle, but hot enough, pretty awful job. And back then they didn't have Walkman or earbuds or podcasts. Right. So you're just sitting there with the hum of the lawnmower for 8 hours. It was really an awful job.
My very first job, it was a one-day thing that I got paid for, other than my mom paying me for washing her car, was someone from the church needed someone to come and do some work in the yard. So I went on a Saturday and worked for like 10 hours, like doing the most brutal labor, lifting super heavy rocks, and with tools I had never used in my life, like those little hedge trimmers and all this stuff, and just making mistake after mistake. So the guy was like yelling at me, and I think for 10 hours I got like $20. So it was like $2 an hour.
I like how you call an edge trimmer a hedge trimmer.
Well, it's an edge trimmer?
Yeah, an edger.
I always thought it was a hedge trimmer.
No. Well, the hand motion you made was, it's a blade, right?
Yeah, that blade. That's an edge trimmer?
Or an edger.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, see, I don't even know what it's called.
Yeah. I think a hedge trimmer technically would just be what do they call it? Those, anyway.
Oh, yeah. It's more like a little mini chainsaw thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So George's father was an artist, a prominent artist, and a sculptor, a designer, and that slots right into that whole system, right?
Right.
In fact, a lot of my dad's heroes, Japanese American guys, are these architects and designers, because they a role model. It's sort of like if you're a black kid, and I found this a lot of the time. I'd be talking with a black teenager, and they all wanted to be in the NBA,
right?
Which is fine, but if that's all you feel like you can do, right? Because they don't have role models as physicians necessarily.
And there's not that many spots open.
Right. And they all think they're going to make it.
Right.
They all, because on the playground, they're pretty good. But
yeah. No, that's a good point, because, for example, with a lot of the Latin community in these areas, there's a lot of gardening, actually. And it must be similar where, someone gets into it. It's like, well, I'm looking for work. It's like, well, actually, I've got this. Either I've got this company or I work for a company like this, or you can start your own like this. Here's the formula.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And when you're 13 and you start thinking about the future, you start to look at, well, what are you qualified to do?
Right.
And a very compelling heuristic is, well, what are the people that look like me? My uncles, my aunties, other people, what are they doing? And when you see that, you think, oh, okay, and you don't see yourself represented in other areas, then you just figure subconsciously that you can't do it. So I'm doing the landscaping, and this it was retirement community, and an old, all the people there were old. And by the way, I think the cutoff age that you had to be was 55.
Okay.
I'm almost 55.
Oh.
so those communities, those retirement, like Shag.
Yeah.
Which is just a very ironic name because of course in Britain shag is to fuck, right?
Yeah.
So there's a retirement condo community in Seattle called Shag.
Hey, man.
But even if you're not thinking of that connotation of Britain,
it's still a weird name
because shag is
shaggy carpet
or shaggy meaning it's not doing well,
Yeah.
So anyway, that's also 55. But anyway, so I'm in the retirement community in Issaquah, Providence Point, for those that are following along. And the woman comes up to me, singles me out of the crew of like 10 people. And I'm the least qualified and says, I want you to be my personal gardener.
Oh my gosh.
And I'm like, really? How much are you paying? I think it was like $25 an hour or something. It was insane.
Right.
So just to let you know, minimum wage at the time was, I think, like $4.50.
$4.50.
Like $4.50 or something. So what minimum wage in Seattle is what, $15?
Yeah.
So that'd be like paying someone $100 an hour or something.
Crazy.
I don't know what the ratio is there, but I was like, whoa, 20. And I'm like, sure. And I'm thinking, how did she choose me? She should have chose anyone else here. And then I go home and I'm telling my dad about it, and he's like, oh, well, you know why she chose you? And I said, no, why did she choose me? He's like, because you're the only Asian and you're Japanese. And I thought, well, what do you mean? He's like, well, when I was a kid, which is where she would have grown up, this older woman, that's what Japanese people were. They were gardeners to white people.
Right.
And I thought, well, I'll take it, $25 an hour. But, it didn't feel good
so interesting
to just be pigeonholed like that, right? Like, oh, he's Japanese. He's like genetically superior,
right?
Even though he has no training and no skill, to just be pigeonholed like that. Or martial arts, or you're black and you must be good at dancing or basketball or something, or you're Asian and you must be good at math, this kind of stuff. Or you're Latino and you must be terrible at math, and you must be interested in drugs. It's just this, anyway. So emotional suppression and unhealthy emotional coping is a pretty big theme. Of course, not every East Asian. And also that contrast with George, who is more Americanized.
Right.
It's not like Japanese people are known for their vulnerability and emotional expression, but he's way more Americanized.
Yeah. And he's more expressive than...
Yeah. He's way more California. The most California guy is George, because he's fourth, fifth generation. Some of the food is representative of Asian, like the kimchi and this kind of stuff.
I love when the cousin first comes out of jail, they're having food somewhere, and he orders 2 ox bone soups. I've never had oxbone soup.
Yeah.
But it sounds interesting.
Yeah. I don't even know that. I assume that's a Korean thing because as a Japanese person, although I do claim kimchi, although, it's very Korean, of course, but all my Japanese American relatives eat a lot of kimchi. And for me, kimchi was half of my diet growing up. So also the fact that George's name is George is a Japanese American thing.
Right.
My grandfather, George Honda, George Takai, there are certain names that Japanese, I'm sure every ethnicity has that, where there are just certain names that when you come to the United States, because you're trying to name your kids names or you'll adopt names that will be easier for white people to pronounce.
Yeah.
There's just a set of names. And I always wonder as to why, why did these names get chosen?
Yeah.
Is it because they were just kind of popular names and you're just like, well, it's like if I were to go to somewhere in Latin America and I just like, I don't know, call me Jose or something.
Yeah.
Just because I know what that name is, maybe that's what people are doing. But I also wonder if there are certain Americanized names that are more pleasing to Japanese people or wherever people are coming from, like they themselves have a better time saying that. I don't know.
I also wonder, George Washington, maybe it's like a...
Well, when Colombians came to the States, did you see that happening where they would adopt a certain name?
No, but you certainly need to shorten your name sometimes, or, like in my case, obviously it was convenient to be able to tell people, just call me Berto, right? But that wasn't a thing just here. My name was shortened by my family. Names are shortened in general.
Yeah.
So, but I never saw like, I should change my name to a gringo name.
Uh-huh. Well, maybe it's because you came later. If you would have come 50, 60 years ago, I think there would have been a temptation to just change your name to Bert.
Yeah, that's true. It could be.
Or something, or Bob.
Yeah.
Because all my relatives in the early 20th century adopted a name. Like I had my great-great-grandfather Wahei Okamoto changed his name to Joe or Joseph. There are a lot of Joes, a lot of Josephs, a lot of Georges. But then there's also this phenomenon of naming your kids. There's a lot of Japanese Americans of my dad's generation of the Ichi-ni Sansei. So my dad is third generation Sansei. And there's a lot of Allens. There's a lot of Carols.
Interesting.
I think there's a lot of Tonys. I'm just thinking of my aunts and uncles at this point. Ronald and Gary and there's a lot of, there's another name Gloria. There's a lot of Glorias in Japanese. So anyway, there's just another little touch. I was like, his name's George. He's Japanese. Also, the pressure that was depicted is very Asian psychology in this show. How would you depict the pressure put on the kids?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly get the sense of urgency, like, because there's one thing about like you have to do good in school, or you have to do well, get a good job. But there was also an urgency about it, like it's got to happen yesterday. Like for example, Danny didn't have a plan like, wow, man, well, we had a big setback, but it might take me 5 years or 10 years. It was like, I got to get this place now. Like so there was that. There was also a desperation about it. Like this kind of sense of helplessness mixed with, I'll do anything. And I suppose the other aspect was that it was a matter of identity. Like I cannot be the person that failed. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. Those are some things I noticed.
Yeah, and for Amy's character, having to sacrifice everything.
Yeah. To
rise in the ranks and gain the prestige and the materialism and the money and the stability. And the materialism. I mean, you could argue that a central foundation for the main characters, Danny and Amy, was materialism and greed. That they were fighting over a road rage incident, but the side stories, their individual stories, is for him, for Danny, he's doing whatever he possibly can, including exploiting a church to get money. Now, he would say, well, I'm trying to provide for my parents, right?
Well, that's the difference that I would note. Like, obviously what he was doing was horrible. And by the way, also so ironic that his true calling in life was, in fact, to be a musician. Like, because that was another interesting thing. He was actually a terrible contractor, know? But it is interesting that his motivations for getting the money, even though he's going about it horribly and does horrible things, don't seem as much about material wealth. It seems more like, I got to fix this for my parents, right?
Right.
Although he did want his parents to love him as a result, right?
Right.
But in her case, there was this additional layer of ostentation, like the need for ostentation, that she didn't actually seem to actually care about, but she felt like she needed.
Right. And the ending, the final couple episodes, really dives deep into this. And they're hallucinating on poisonous berries and talking about their insecurities and how they both just wanted to be loved, and
Right.
they were running from being alone. The experience that they felt when they were young, for Danny, his parents fighting all the time, and the pressure that Danny probably felt as the oldest son, trying to take care of his younger brother and feeling responsible and never feeling like he's good enough, and never feeling like he's loved. And maybe that's why he turned to the sketchy cousin originally for the counterfeited formula, because he's like, well, maybe then my parents will love me. And he shoots himself in the foot. And then for Amy, she's constantly trying to be loved, and she talks very specifically about, and also I guess another contrast is Amy's character, being middle upper class, goes to therapy to talk about it.
Right.
And for him, Danny, he's more talking with friends and this kind of thing.
He complaining to his cousin.
Right. And so for Amy, she also felt like love was conditional, and that was just such a powerful scene. And Ali Wong just nails the performance. When people cry in movies, since I'm a professional, literally I'm paid to listen to people cry, to watch people cry. Over the past 25 years, I've picked up on the authenticity of different kinds or the ways that different kind of crying looks. And the crying that Ali Wong, performs while she's in therapy, she puts her lip, you have to see it. She starts to cry, and it looks very natural. And her mouth kind of does this diagonal thing. Yeah. Cause she's trying to clamp down, she's like, like it's about to burst, but she's trying to keep it together. It was just beautifully acted and shot, and it was just awesome. Anyway, but she's talking about how she's like, is there such a thing as unconditional love? And the therapist is like, oh, okay, I think we're getting somewhere. I think you're talking about your parents, because she was just but then the therapist is like, well, tell me more. And Amy says, well, because I don't know if I can love my husband for what he did.
Right.
And the therapist is like, oh, okay.
Almost.
Yeah. But I felt like I just wanted the therapist to...
Well, and what's great about that scene is we as the audience know that she's actually not just talking about her husband, because she knows what she did.
Right.
And so she's actually asking, can my husband unconditionally love me because I've done something terrible? And then also, can I unconditionally... And really under the surface is, can I be unconditionally loved by my parents? And the therapist only has one of those at the start. It's like, oh, you're talking about your parents. And then thinks that it's only the other one. And then, of course, misses that there's this third one. And it's great. It's a great scene.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And incidentally, as a therapist, this happens all the time. Clients will talk tangentially about the core issue. And when I would see that, I would just go with the tangential issue, because subconsciously I figured or guessed that they were processing on the more fundamental issue, but we were talking about a tangential issue. So if I were that therapist, I would say, well, what do you think? Is it possible for you to love your husband even though he did this? And depending on how things went, I might introduce the notion of like, well, yeah, I mean, some people absolutely love is unconditional, and it's up to you, of course, as to whether or not you want to love him. If this destroys your love, it's just a personal choice. But for example, parents, typically good parents, good enough parents who don't come from transgenerational trauma at the very least are, well, I don't even want to say that. I'll just say that parents who do this for whatever reason, because you can come from transgenerational trauma and still do this, where you will exhibit and embody unconditional love. Your kid can make massive mistakes, and typically kids don't make terrible mistakes. They make kid mistakes.
Yeah.
And parents absolutely, from the bottom of their hearts, still deeply, deeply love their children. So I would throw that out there, because I would be thinking, I think we're really talking about your parents here. And so for Amy, she's constantly trying to rise in the ladder of success. And she's always constantly trying to prove herself to other people. Like, look at me, I'm worthy. I bought this house for you. I've given husband the chance that you can be at home with the daughter. Like, I've set everything up. Do you love me now? Am I lovable? Right. But in her, racing towards this finish line, she is alienating and distancing herself and being cold and thus ultimately not getting any kind of love. And there are these wonderful moments where George, because you could easily write George into a corner where he's this floppy femme.
Sure.
Or he's cartoonishly new age or something, because they did a little bit of that. But there were moments where George it just seemed, and Amy, when they would talk, they would have these really genuine moments where it seemed like, okay, like
right.
tell
There's
me
something
about
to build on top of.
Yeah, tell me about what you thought. There were so many moments with the characters where Danny and Amy, they kind of make up, right? They meet in a parking lot, and then the guy honks at them, and they both
look. Yes.
Yeah. And Amy and Ali Wong, she is such a comedic acting genius. Like, I just love to watch her facial expressions. But she calls the guy in the other car a shriveled ball sack, or what does she say? I mean, oh man, I just want to get into a fight with someone so I can use it. You shriveled ball sack, or shriveled nut, or something.
I don't know if you were gonna get at this, but there were several points throughout the story where you're like, oh, they're turning a leaf. Oh, and you know what the show is like, so you're probably thinking it's not, but part of you wants it to work. You're like, yes, this is the way out. Mm-hmm. Just keep going in this direction.
Right.
Hold hands and walk in that direction.
Yeah, and then everything would fall apart.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so the same thing with her and George. Right. There were moments where you're like, okay, so there is a foundation. This can work.
Right.
And actually, I would say that was true with a lot of them. Like, a genius of this was that it gave you enough moments like that where you wanted the cousin to make it.
Right.
Okay, he's out of jail, but he's a good guy. It's like, we can do this,
And then he slaps Danny across the face. Yeah. So a common immigrant story to the United States, from whether it's Europe or China or Poland or Africa, Colombia, is that you might be coming from transgenerational trauma, you might be coming from poverty.
Right.
Particularly in the past, a lot of people came to the States because they were running from death. Like the Swedish people that came over, because I've done all this genealogy, a lot of the relatives, the siblings and the cousins of the Swedish people that made it to the United States, they all died young.
Ooh.
It doesn't say why.
Okay.
It doesn't say why, because they didn't keep records of that back then. But there was a famine going on.
Oh my gosh.
And I have pictures of these people, and they look like everything's fine, but half of that whole generation just died in Sweden. So they
were running from some sort of disaster.
Yeah. So you come to the States, and you're and you're being oppressed by the majority, right? So your path to existing on the planet and not dying is financial stability.
Yeah.
And so that becomes your sole focus.
Number one thing.
You don't think about anything else.
Sure.
You're just obsessed with making sure that you have money, you have investments, you're making good choices. You're not buying things that you don't need. And
so I can certainly relate to how my mom was like that, or is, but definitely was like that, because she was that first generation. So she was like, no nonsense. We can't spend money frivolously. We're gonna succeed here. We gotta pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and like really put money away and blah blah blah. Super conservative, not like politically, just like super conservative with money and everything, right? And then I'm second generation, and so I'm like, money, we should spend it all.
Right.
Yeah, and I've seen that with a lot of my actual, with my Asian friends too, where like they're totally not as concerned with, being so. They're looser with their money than their parents were.
Right.
Yeah.
And then they'll have kids that will be even more loose, and it'll be like a George. So another aspect that was very Asian American, specifically Korean American, about this TV show was the depiction of the Christian church.
Yeah.
White Americans might not know this, but most Korean Americans are devout Christians. Yeah, right. I don't know the percentage exactly, but it's up there. And there's a lot of Korean Christian churches in the United States. And I think it's particularly Christian. I think in Korea, the percentage of Christians is up there, but not nearly as high as Korean Americans going to church.
By the way, another genius point in the show, and another one of those where you're like, oh no. So he goes to the church, he goes to the and he's crying and all these things, and that was genuine. Like he really was crying, like down, because you could feel his insides pouring out.
Yeah,
right. And so you go through that, but then it was like, oh, can you play? It's like, yeah, I can play. But we have no information up to that point that he's musical. Now, they go on to the other scenes with the show, and then a song starts playing with someone singing while the scene is playing out. And then at the end, it pans back, and it's him singing with this beautiful voice.
And I'm pretty sure it was live. Like, I don't know about you, but...
It looked live.
When I watch these kinds of depictions on TV and movie shows, one of the first things I'm evaluating is if it's live or not.
Well, it was a very nuanced performance, so it'd be very hard to lip sync.
Well,
you know what I mean?
The drummer, the bassist, the keyboardist were either lip syncing exactly on the because it's amazing to me. They'll have a movie like The Wedding Singer or something, and they have a pretty big budget, and they have a nameless extra playing the bass, and you can tell that person has never held a bass in their life. I'm thinking it wouldn't be that hard to hire someone that plays the bass. They would probably do it for free if they're in a movie. And they just don't even find someone that knows that they've never held an instrument in their life. Whereas in this TV show, it looked like a real performance. I'm guessing they had to do it a few times to get it right, but it's a pretty complicated song.
And I gotta say, in that moment, there's this additional thing of like, oh, dude, you missed your, like, this is you.
Yeah.
And it's heartbreaking because he doesn't even recognize it because he thinks he's using them. Meaning, whether part of him is like, oh, yeah, I love doing this. There's that other part of him is like, okay, this is how I'm going to get the money.
He's still on the take.
Yeah.
Because that's his foundation.
Oh, it's so sad.
Yeah.
You're not a handy person. You're terrible at that.
Right. Yeah. And I didn't even think about that.
Yeah.
That there are these moments where you're like, oh, you could be doing something else. Amy's character talks about this too.
Yeah.
She reminisces about being in college. She's talking to Paul, for example, and she's like, yeah, I just kind of miss those times when I was young and I didn't care about things and I could just be myself. And you're thinking, you could be there.
You could do that.
Yeah.
And because the thing is, it's not just the music. He goes on to actually become a leader in the church.
Yeah.
And actually, he's doing good. And he's putting his shoddy workmanship at least to good use and all these. But he's still on the take. He's still not getting that. Wait a minute. Like, he's not hitting pause and going, wait, actually, this is nice.
Yeah. Another nice thing that I liked about that whole scene, especially that when he first starts crying, is that it's so rare to see a depiction in popular media of religion being a positive thing.
Right.
Now, you wouldn't walk away from this TV show saying it was like telling everyone they should be Christian.
No.
It was just a regular, nuanced depiction. You had an asshole who was in the... and I don't really like that guy as an actor. He's from Umbrella Academy.
Oh, I've not seen... I read the graphic novel, but I haven't seen the show.
I just don't think that actor has the chops to keep up with...
What character did he play in Umbrella Academy?
He plays one of the kids. He's this... he turns into this monster thing.
Oh, I know who he is. Okay.
This giant, octopusy thing. But in the TV show, he's dead, so he's only occasionally in the show. And those scenes are great, but when he's called upon to actually kind of deliver, like later on, I think season 3 in Umbrella Academy, which I did not like. Season 1 and 2 is some of the best TV I've ever seen. Season 3, it centers on him, and it's an alternate universe, and he's a jerk, and he's just not a very good actor.
I see.
I'm just going to tell you that.
I will say, in this show, he was fine, but he was certainly side,
Yeah.
I almost would say that his interaction was the one cartoony thing about
That's what I'm
the
saying.
show.
Maybe it was
and I'm
written...
not even just saying just his acting. I'm saying that storyline, that one could have been trimmed back a little bit.
Yeah.
Because it's too convenient. It was like, one thing is that he starts becoming a leader in the church, and actually maybe there's someone there that starts fancying him, and maybe he has a conversation with his ex that turns out that they could have been something, but it was a little too far. That's like, oh, now she wants him, and the other guy, his nemesis, is actually a dork, and that was a little too high school drama for me.
Right.
But it was such a small part that I didn't.
Yeah. It seemed like it was written into the script to have an antagonist, to have someone that Danny would be kind of playing.
Yeah.
And also to raise questions as to who burned down that apartment that he was building.
Right.
But another Asian American...
Sorry, but even that one, they didn't set that up. There was already enough second guessing as like, well, it was probably her. Like that was enough there to add the additional subterfuge. What was weird about it, it was like, well, they didn't set that up well enough because, yeah, he beat him at basketball. He's going to burn down his house?
But maybe that was the point, is they just wanted it to be like pretty ambiguous. It turns out it's Danny himself.
Yeah, I mean, I loved, because that to me would have been enough. You already thought it was her. They had the scene perfectly set up where she's eating the burger right afterwards, and you're like, oh, gosh, she burned down the place. And it makes sense. He just ruined her relation, or, because of his brother and stuff. And then it's his own damn fault, right?
Yeah.
Like, that was enough.
Yeah.
But still,
Yeah. Another Asian American, you might be able to relate to this a little bit, Berto, is the basketball tournament.
Oh, yeah.
So Asian Americans love to play basketball, and it's something that is not talked about enough, right? Because I don't think a lot of people consider Asian Americans to be super into playing basketball.
Probably not, but I gotta be honest, I played basketball all the time because of my Asian friends.
Yeah.
And sadly, I stopped playing basketball when I stopped seeing a lot of them because I didn't have anyone else who would play basketball.
Yeah. I played basketball throughout my childhood and beyond. My dad loved to play basketball. He was really good. My grandfather, George Honda, was a star on the basketball team.
Oh, nice.
On a white basketball team.
Right.
So he was the only non-white person, and he was one of the star players.
That's awesome.
So yeah, it's.
I would regularly play with all those guys. Dave, Chong, Shun, all.
I don't know what it is. I mean, I think part of it is that being good at a sport, it doesn't matter what race you are.
Yeah.
So if you're being pushed down in other areas, one of the areas that it's a level playing field is sports.
Yeah.
And so I think that's one element that will motivate people to put the effort into becoming better. But I also just wonder if, I don't know, like it sounds stupid coming out of my face, but Asians, I think on average can be pretty coordinated when they want to be. And basketball requires a lot of coordination. And maybe also Asian Americans tend to be smaller and slighter on average, of course. And of the sports, ironically, for basketball, especially if you're not playing like college or NBA, being short isn't necessarily that much of a hindrance,
If you're fast and you can pass well and shoot well.
Right. Because if you're playing in a tournament or on the playground or even, in high school sometimes, the tallest guy is probably 6'2" or something. So if you're 5'5" or 5'8", you're in the mix. But once you get to the upper levels, you have to be a lot bigger, a lot taller to compete.
Well, there's also a convenience factor. Like, I mean, it's so much easier to play basketball than a lot of other sports in terms of the going out and doing it. Like, if we're like, hey, let's go play some football. Like, that's a big production. I mean, one thing if you're just throwing the ball, but if we're going to go play baseball, it's a big thing.
This is why soccer is the world sport.
Soccer's trivial.
Yeah. You just, and you don't even
two sweaters on the ground.
Right. And two sticks that represent the goal. So, I wonder, I'd love to hear from the listeners what theories you might have as to why Asian Americans take to basketball so much, because it's a big deal among Asian Americans. Not all. Okay, let's take a break, and when we get back, more beef. Okay, we're back from the break. Also, let's see, other things in my notes. The microaggressions, they were there, but they weren't super cartoony. When the worker for Amy says a Japanese phrase, you could absolutely see, and she was trying to impress Amy, she was trying to suck up to her. And it would be very common for a white person to think that a Japanese phrase would go over well with a Chinese Vietnamese woman.
I wonder if she also got confused because she has a relationship with George. I mean, and so maybe she just doesn't know. She's like, she must also be Japanese.
Right. So that is you could absolutely see a white American in 2023 making that mistake today. Because when microaggressions are depicted in movies and TV shows, a lot of times they're really cartoonish, like even white audience members will say, whoa, that's crossing a line, Whereas that one, it's a little bit more subtle. Like there's a possibility that people watching the show didn't even necessarily know what was happening in that scene, you
Right.
know? Because Amy's character is like, oh, yeah.
Oh, that's true. Because it's not like you might not even recognize it was Japanese, and then you might not recognize she isn't.
Well,
and
she says, she's like, oh, isn't that such and such in Japanese?
Oh, okay.
And then Amy's like, oh, and Amy's polite,
Sure.
because that's what you do when you have a microaggression against you. You just sort of grin and bear it, and they just move on with the scene.
Yeah.
It's not explicitly where Amy is like, well, you realize I'm Chinese and Vietnamese, right? Like they don't spell it out. So it's a very, and then Amy's boss, the white woman, she also commits a few more egregious microaggressions.
But again, they don't keep doing it the whole show. So one of the complaints right now about a lot of the shows that Marvel has been putting out, or even movies where it features a lot of women superheroes, is that so many of the scenes are bashing men. And so it's like this balance of like, yes, we get it. Men can be horrible pigs. Not every man in every scene has to be a horrible pig.
Well, and also, this is a side tangent. And art is art. If you like She-Hulk, whatever. But it's so pervasive. When I was watching She-Hulk, for example, I
haven't seen, but
I was like, okay, I can. This is interesting. The style is so different because she's a lawyer, and there's actual court scenes, and it's comedy, and there's twerking, and So I was on board, but I started feeling like it just didn't grab me, and then I stopped watching about halfway through, just thinking, I think there's other things to watch. Then I watched some breakdowns on YouTube, and there's a lot of misogyny on YouTube, but the channels that weren't misogynistic were saying, let's look at different superhero stories.
Yeah.
Let's look at success. Let's look at what makes the Hulk previous movies, or the Iron Man previous movies, or the Ant-Man previous movies. Okay, yeah, sure, these are white guys, but getting rid of race.
You watched the same video I watched, because
let's actually analyze and what makes these shows emotionally satisfying. Right. These characters start off very incompetent.
Yeah, they have terrible flaws.
Yeah, they have Iron Man.
Yeah.
He's selfish. He's narcissistic.
Self-destructive.
He's self-destructive. He has a panic disorder. He has trauma. He's screwing things up.
Yeah.
But yes, in the end, he prevails.
Yeah.
So many of these women characters, they are writing with no flaws, without any. They transcend all adversity before the adversity even shows up. She-Hulk becomes a Hulk because blood gets on her. Fine, whatever. There's a lot of silliness,
but that's fine. Like every superhero is weird, right?
And she immediately has all the competence in the world and can control the Hulk aspect, whereas Banner, it took him...
He still can't control.
It took him 15 years.
Yeah.
He spent all of Ragnarok stuck in the Hulk mode, and when he didn't, when he became Banner again, he's like, what happened?
Yeah.
And they're like, you've been Hulk for 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
And Banner, his psychology was all kind of messed up, and that's interesting, right?
So this is the thing I was saying as well when we were starting this conversation, is those shows aren't just a good show with good character development. It's got a bit of a, well, we got to really make a statement here about how women can be awesome, right? It's like, yeah, you can do that, but you don't have to have the whole show revolve around that statement, and not and eschew like actual good character development. It's like, come on, Beef has amazing Asians acting as normal, awesome characters in great storylines.
Right. It's fucking condescending to women.
Have we checked the box? Because now we got to go make other shows.
Yeah, it treats women as fragile viewers.
Yeah.
They're not fragile.
Yeah.
They can take nuance.
Yeah.
They've been putting up with shit for a long time. Give them a well-rounded character. Give them a character that has flaws. And sure, you can absolutely sprinkle in gender and overcoming things, but you don't want to slap people across the face with it.
One of my favorite shows in a few years back was Homeland. You remember Homeland with Claire Danes?
I mean, I remember hearing about it.
Oh my gosh. First few seasons, especially, such a good show. She was the protagonist. She was a mess, dude. She had kind of sexual addiction. She had a lot of, I forget if it was bipolar. She had some sort of issues that she had to take medicine. She was a mess. And she was the heroine, the star, and she was great. And she was also really smart, but really flawed. And so good.
Yeah.
And it was a show with great character arcs, great plots, things, with a great, strong female lead who was very, like, interesting.
Right.
You know?
So Amy's character, Ali Wong, is a great character with adversity and flaws, but relatable.
Yeah.
Has vulnerability. You want her to succeed. She has power. She makes mistakes. She gets what's coming to her. And in the end, you could argue it's a happy ending, right? It's a happy ending.
A glorious resolution. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because these two
especially
souls,
where things could have gone.
right.
You know?
These two souls finally found another one that understood their deal.
Right. So the feminism of this script is women are humans too.
Yeah.
What a novel thought.
It's crazy.
Women can have all the regular three-dimensionality of life that anyone else can have. And we will depict that in all of its richness.
That's right.
We will not just make anyway, yeah. So the last couple things that are Asian about the show that I was really happy to see is the aspect of having a sketchy cousin. So in my family, in a lot of Korean American families, a lot of Chinese American families, Vietnamese American families, Filipino American families, a lot of us can point to the sketchy cousin, the sketchy cousin, who's very similar to the Isaac was the sketchy cousin, where he's not like a flat out gang member, but he has angles to things. He knows certain kinds of people. He can set you up.
I certainly knew people through my Korean friends that were in the Isaac direction.
Yeah. Right. Now, it should be pointed out that David Choe, the actor who plays Isaac, the sketchy cousin, 9 years ago on a podcast. So this is a big controversy. In fact, there was a lot of criticism that they even cast him in the TV show.
I didn't know this. What's the deal?
He was on a podcast a number of years ago, and he joked about sexually assaulting a massage therapist, forcing her to watch him masturbate, forcing her to hold his penis, and then forcing her to perform oral sex on him. Rape. He raped. He told a story on a podcast.
It was a joke or what?
So there's a big backlash.
Oh my gosh!
The episode comes out, and he later says it was a fictional story in which he was joking the whole time.
Okay.
I don't know the whole story, but it was unfortunate that sort of tainted the TV show a little bit. So, that should be pointed out. And the last very Asian thing was the slurping of the noodles and just slurping in general. I grew up Japanese American, the Japanese American aspects of even though I'm half, there was a lot of Japanese American aspects of my family for various reasons, but one of which is I didn't realize.
Isn't it impolite not to slurp the noodles?
No, but it's definitely okay.
Yeah. I thought there was something in Tampopo about it. Like, you got to slurp the noodles.
Well, maybe. Not that I've heard of. Okay. It's not like if you had someone that was being quiet that somehow you'd be like, how dare you or something. But it doesn't even register to me until I started hanging out with Stacy a lot.
Oh.
Because I slurp everything.
Okay.
I slurp coffee. I slurp soup. And it would drive her crazy. And she'd be like...
Which is ironic, because you're so particular about lip sounds.
I don't even like that. I don't even hear it. When it's udon or as you call it, udon, when it's ramen or whatever, I don't even register it, and I never even noticed it until Stacy started pointing it out. And so...
I should call it udon.
There was a fair amount of slurping of noodles, which when Stacy and I were watching, I'm like, see, it's normal. Okay, Berto, as usual, we're going way over time. So let's break this into 2 episodes. So let's end this part 1.
Okay.
And when we return in a couple of days, we will talk about the rest of, because I got a lot more to say.
This is making me kind of rageful. I don't know.
So tune in next time when we continue talking about beef. And everyone out there, please take care of yourself because
you deserve it.